My iron is heating up, and here is my 1.5 yards of cloth that I pulled off of the rest of the yardage. And I'm only going to press half of the width at a time, just because that's what I can fit on this board. But I can see my centerfold right along here, and I'm going to just use that as the sight line. Now I'm going to begin in the middle. I'm going to use lots and lots of steam, but I'm not going to use a lot of pressure. What I want is the heat and the moisture to change the nature of the fibers. I want them to expand or shrink however is right for them. So I'm not using a whole lot of pressure. I'm holding on to the iron and I'm floating it over the fabric as I work. I don't know if you could see it with the angle of the light, if you could see the fabric kind of warp and change shape a little bit. Now it's nice and flat, and I'm just going to advance it. I'm just going to pull the next chunk up onto the table. And you'll notice when I do this, I really do like to start in the center of the area and work my way out. I find that this helps get a much more even shrink and steam. Now remember, this isn't about the pressure, this is about the heat and the moisture. I have pressed all 3 of my fabrics, and now I'm going to start the actual layout and chalking them in place and then cutting them out. What I will do is, let me line up the fabrics. So with this wool, I've actually torn a line, and that gives me a nice clean edge, and I've checked to make sure that my fabric is mostly square so that I can cut easily. When you see a layout, whether it's modern or historical, you'll see that the fold is usually towards you in an image and the selvages are further away. I am going to begin with the back. Here's my back pattern piece. It doesn't really matter too much, but I'm going to go ahead and just determine that that direction is up. So I'll put the bottom of this pattern piece toward the cut edge, and then I'll try to make sure that everything fits with that direction being up. So I'm going to put my pattern weights down. This is just a simple wax chalk. You could use a little sliver of soap if you want. All right, 1 down. Just a few more to go. For the most part, you are going to aim for these 2 points just going against the selvage edge. And I'm keeping them just slightly in because the weave structure changes when you get right up next to the edge of the fabric. And then I'm going to put my pattern weights down. Now the pattern piece is upside down, so I can't see any of my notes, but I can see all of my notches. Should make an effort to run the chalk in nice, smooth segments so that you don't end up with a choppy line. All right, now I'm going to need this pattern piece a second time to cut the second sleeve, but for now I'm going to set it aside so that I can shift my fabric around without too much trouble. And at this point I'm not really worried about pinning or anything. I just want to get all of the pieces chalked in place where they belong. Then I'll worry about pinning the layers together so that I can cut. Before I trace that out, I'm going to grab another pattern piece and make sure that I have the right place to cut this skirt. What I'll do with the skirt to make sure that I use my fabric efficiently, so I'll take this skirt piece and I will nestle it in here. There's 2 different ways. I could try this way, but then I'm getting into the area where I need to cut the second sleeve. So I believe if I put it there, then I have plenty of room to cut the second sleeve. So I think that's what I'm going to do. I can push this doublet front all the way to the edge here, which is where my white chalk line is, and then I can just nestle this in as far as it will go. And if I really wanted to have fun, I could just push this even further, cut off this portion of the sleeve cap, grab a scrap of fabric from over here, piece it in place, and be able to complete the pattern for the sleeve. But I want to save time. Now typically with this kind of cutting, you want to put the larger pieces in place first, then work your way down to the smaller pieces. That is in place. Now I just have two pieces left to cut. I have to cut the second sleeve and I need to cut the back skirt. I'm going to shift the fold back up onto the table so that I can see clearly. And then I'm going to do the same thing that I did before, which is to match up the two foremost points. And I'm going to go ahead and chalk this in place. There's my second sleeve. And with skirting like this, it's not a terrible thing if it is slightly off grain. It's not anything that really has to fit the way the body of the garment does, so what the grain does is somewhat irrelevant. And if you'll notice, as I'm throwing the pins in, I'm keeping them very flat to the surface of the fabric as I work. And I'm just pinning everything that I can get my hands on in this area before I shift the fabric. It'll help everything stay flat and aligned if I do all the pinning first. One of the reasons I'm excited to show you this particular layout process is because many of you will not have a perfect costume shop setup. You might not have a big cutting table that you can work at. Particularly in New York, these apartments and studios are quite small. As we begin to cut, I am just going to start with this piece, this sleeve that's right next to the selvage. I always find that it's best to start the cutting in an area that's close to one of the edges rather than the fold. And the principle here when you're cutting should be to cut the line off. And that's because you added the thickness of the piece of chalk, whatever that was, whether it's a thin line or a fat line. When you cut to the inside of it, you are always guiding where the actual piece of pattern paper was and not the extra fatness of the chalk line. You'll notice that I am going to great pains to cut my way into the corner, because you should never try to cut your way out of a corner. You run a great risk of clipping the fabric in a way that's unrepairable. As I do each piece, I will go through and make all of my clip notches. It's very important because these notches later on will help us align the pieces so that we can have a garment that goes together without a lot of fight. As much as possible, you want to make sure that you don't cut across empty spaces to get to other locations in the layout. And the reason for that is the same reason that I was talking about earlier. It's all about fabric conservation. Any of these larger pieces can be used for something else. So say, for example, here, I just cut the sleeve out over here, and I could very easily have just cut straight across to get to the front and to the front skirt. But instead, I'm leaving this piece intact so that if I need it for something else later, I have a bigger piece that I can work with. step, the first thing that I'll do is put the front in place. And this is because we're not actually going to pin this piece down or anything. We are going to trace around it kind of wide and slightly sloppy, and that will give us this nice margin to work with. The margin becomes very important because what we'll do is we'll manipulate the shape, we'll put the padding on, we'll do all of this sculpting of the canvas, and we'll leave extra margins outside. And then okay, now that that's in place, I'll move this out of the way, and then I'll put in my pins. The remaining pattern pieces can just be put in place efficiently on the cloth and cut out. There's no need to add extra width around any of these because just by virtue of them being here, we're going to naturally cut just a slight margin around them, and we can use that as our guideline. When we're sewing these together, we're just going to baste around the edges anyway, so I just need to shift this over. This cutting surface is a little small. I'm going to pin the back in place over here. The linen shifts a little bit, so every time I move this fabric, I'm making sure to like look at the threads and make sure that they're kind of aligned and correct. That way, I don't run the risk of getting something cut off grain. In order to use the fabric more efficiently, I've turned this over and I have it the wrong side down, and because of that I have to carefully remove my pins from the other side and replace them on this side. All right, with these things in place, I can go ahead and cut. In this next step, we'll cut the lining out. There's not a ton of really important information here, except that once again, the front lining is going to be cut slightly different than the actual body of the exterior. And I'll do it first because I want to be along this edge. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is once it's in place, I'm just going to pin the center front. And I'm just pinning this flat and into the shoulder, front of the armhole. Now, here's where it gets interesting. And I'll pin along the bottom only to here. Now, all of this is unpinned, and there's good reason for that. What we're going to do is we're going to make a little pinch in the fabric. Now, I'm going to have to pull it up here. So I'm going to do a pinch, and this is both layers together. And the pinch is, I would say, just under a centimeter, or not quite 3/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to take this pin right here. So it's 9 millimeters deep, which is about 18 millimeters total, and about 3/8 of an inch deep, or 3/4 of an inch total. And with that in place, then I'll keep all of this smooth, but I'll keep that pinch right there, and then I'll just try to pin the rest of this in flat. And then when I cut this out, I'm actually going to cut about 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters, 12 millimeters up, and I'm going to blend that into the front of the armhole and blend it into the back of the armhole. And what that does is it gives us a little bit of ease in the lining in the armhole, and that allows us to mold and shape and add fullness in a way that prevents it from affecting the shape of the exterior. Now the back is slightly different in that I am going to leave a little extra at center back. I'm going to cut the bottom slightly long. And I'll just cut a little bit of extra room around all edges, probably about, I would say about 1/8 of an inch, maybe, 4 millimeters. And I'm just pinning all these layers down just because I want to keep them together. There's no real need to pull them apart. And with the lining, we are definitely cutting it larger than this piece anyway, so we don't need to be stupendously accurate. We just need to be accurate enough, and that's what this will do. So I'm going to put the front skirts here. You'll notice that I'm using the opposite grain line. So instead of being straight this way, I'm cutting them cross grain, and that's just because I will waste less fabric that way, unless, hold on, let me see if this works. And this is something I do all the time, to sort of fiddle with it until I'm using up as little as possible. Yeah, I can scoot this in here and just nest it in as deep as I can get it without crowding too much. Because remember, I'm going to cut a little bit of a margin around my back and around my front. Not huge, but about 1/8 of an inch. So that 1/8 of an inch / few millimeters becomes really important in giving the lining just enough ease to sit well without ever pulling on the exterior and changing the way it drapes. So I'll put this sleeve right up here against this edge, and I'll pin that in place. Okay, and then I'll get and I can just nestle it in right there. Barely enough length for me. I probably would do well to be more careful about my fabric conservation. I really wasn't paying as much attention as I should, and now I'm regretting it. I'm gonna turn this over. I'm just gonna scoot it down a little bit. What do you know? I have plenty of room. Okay, and now I'm ready to cut. So you can see that I've just left all this excess at the back, and what I'm going to do is I know that my seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch, so I'm just going to put a little notch right at the 3/8 of an inch mark, and that gives me where I know I need to start sewing, and then the rest of it can just be eased in. But also I've cut it about 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch longer than the actual pattern piece. So I'm going to do that same thing here with the front. I'm going to cut this just a little bit long, and then I'm going to run that a slightly narrower as I get down into the front, but I'm still cutting excess into it, and that just gives me a lot of ease inside, which I'll have to secure at some point. But it means that I'm never going to be fighting the lining to fit. The lining will just be eased in place and it'll go right in. Now, here's the thing. It does need to be slightly higher in the bottom of the armhole in the lining, and that has to do with the curvature of how it goes on the body, the way that it's worn, the fact that when it's on the body it kind of curves outward, and also it'll get caught on underlayers. So we're going to give extra ease in length through the side to keep the lining from tugging at the exterior. I don't know, some of you may have made garments before where you cut the lining the same length as the exterior and then you put it together and it seems like the lining's weirdly tight at the side. And that's exactly what we're avoiding when we do this. And it's about 1/2 inch at the deepest part of the pit, blending to 0 at the front of the armhole and going up into the shoulder. And then just cut a tiny bit wider around all edges. Now you can see that I've got extra width across the chest and I have extra height in the bottom of the armpit. And that'll be really essential to making the lining fit nicely in place. I'm just going to take my pins out of all the layers, and then I will organize them into working piles. Because the lining is made at a different time, I usually will take the lining and just put it in its own piles separate from the interlining and the exterior. But even in the case of the front, the interlining has to be padded and sculpted first, so that can also be left separate. As you've noticed, at this point, I have been cutting both sleeves with the same outer curve. And what I'm going to do now, with the lining and the exterior put together, I am going to mark out the shape of the armpit so that I can have an outer and an inner sleeve. The way that I like to do this is probably less precise than it could be, but I just find the bottom of the armhole, I fold the paper back, and then I make my little mark, and then I'll find the line for the back slope, or for the front slope, and then for the back slope, and then I will just connect the dots so that I can create this nice sigh in the pit. And then I'm also going to mark, here's where my sleeve cap is, and then just below that I'm going to mark where the armpit is, and then I'll circle it. That way I know where it is. So now, just getting all my pins out of the way so I don't damage my scissors, now I just follow that line and I cut out the bottom of the sleeve and make sure my notch goes in. All right, that's it for cutting out. Our next step in our next segment is going to be constructing the canvas for the front. Thanks for watching.